Hi everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we are going to play with yellow acid dyes, specifically Jacquard Bright Yellow. And we're going to play with depths of shade and see if we can create a fade set with yellow. Because this is a little bit trickier than it might seem.
Yellow is a lot of fun, but overall, a yellow is not that saturated of a color, even when it's really bright and intense. And so it's really easy to overwhelm it with other colors. And if you think about it, if a yellow gets way too dark and intense, then you get into the orange category. If you look at a lot of yellow dyes, they speckle orange. And so this is something that makes it harder, I think, to get a pastel to deep yellow and really see that gradient in an obvious way. A lot of yellows look very similar at close depths of shade. So today I want to do 5 different depths of shade of this yellow, see if we get something that feels like a gradient or maybe not. But I know that in the past when I've tried dip dyeing into yellow acid dye, the transitions weren't as extreme as I was hoping for. Now, I have just dip dyed a single skein into yellow dye in the past and been able to get saturated to less. I believe that one was with food coloring. So I just want to see if we can plan something with intent. And maybe it'll feel like we're going to go from a butter yellow all the way to something that's a little more golden. But keep in mind that when I've done color mixing triangle exercise, the color that is always the least dominant color is the yellow. And I think that has to do just with the hue of it overall. I'm not very well versed in color theory. This is just my hypothesis from playing with a lot of dyes. Today we are going to dye 5 20-gram mini skeins of Wool to Dye-Force titanium sock. This yarn is 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon. It's 2-ply, which I love. I love thicker ply yarn, even if when we're dealing with something fingering weight overall. And so this yarn is a lot of fun. I added a zip tie around the mini skeins to help keep them from getting tangled. And I am going to pre-soak this yarn in some plain tap water for at least 30 minutes. We're going for a tonal overall, but I do want the yarn to be well saturated because since I want to compare the depth of shade on each of these minis, I would prefer that the color be a little more even so that way we can do that comparison. But I don't mind a little tonal variation. What is DOS, or depth of shade? The depth of shade is the number of grams of dye per 100 grams of fabric or fiber. So a 1% depth of shade would be 1 gram of dye per 100 grams of yarn. A 4% would be 4 grams, a 1/4% would be 1/4 of a gram, and so on and so forth. And so knowing how many grams you need, if you're starting from a stock solution, which refers to the number of grams of dye per 100 milliliters of solution, where a 1% stock solution would be 1 gram of dye in 100 milliliters, you know you would need 100 milliliters to get that 1 gram of your stock, or 400 milliliters, and etc. Today we're dyeing 20-gram mini skeins, so the volume of that 1% stock solution, which is a couple months old, so it's not fresh, but everything we're doing today will be relative to the same stock, so I'm not really concerned about it not being the most accurate. But since we're going to be dyeing 20-gram mini skeins, we will need only 1/5 of the amount of dye that we would have needed if we were dyeing 100 grams. And so that's how I got to these numbers. Now let's look at the range of shades that we're going for. So the biggest one is going to be 4%, and the smallest is actually going to be 0.01
6%. This range is a lot bigger. Each time I'm using only a quarter of the amount of dye that I did in the previous one. Normally for a fade set, I might divide by 2. So we might see anywhere from a 1% depth of shade to a 0.0625% depth of shade. But as I said with yellow, I want to bring things even more extreme, bring us something even more pastel and more saturated. With most dyes, you don't really want to go much above a 4%. I think that the limit might be around 6 to 8%, but it depends on the dye. So we will see how this turns out. One other quick note, this volume of 0.3 milliliters is not an easy one to measure. Oh, do I have a 1 ml syringe? If I have a 1 milliliter syringe handy, then that actually wouldn't be so bad and I could do it. But otherwise, if you only have graduated cylinders or larger syringes, you can make a stock solution that isn't 1%. You could, for example, make a stock solution that is 0.2%. And so then that would mean that you would need to use 5 times the volume for each of these, which might be easier to measure. So you can play with the math a little bit, and I'll refer you to my math of yarn dyeing video where I show calculations starting with both a 1% stock solution and a 2% stock solution, and I talk more about how you go about that math. In general, the total milliliters of dye can be calculated by your grams of yarn times our depth of shade, which is the grams of dye, divided by 100 grams of yarn, and then all that divided by the concentration of your stock solution, which would be grams of dye per 100 milliliters. So if we were gonna dye 20 grams of yarn, and we wanted it at a 1% DOS, and our stock solution is gonna be 0.2%, that would give us 100 milliliters of solution, which is consistent with what we would have here. So if our stock solution is 0.2 grams, it's a fifth of this, and we're only dyeing 20 milliliters, this times 5 is 100. I know I just did that really, really quickly, so if it would be helpful for me to do very long form or with a spreadsheet talking about all the math again, let me know if you want another super math intensive video versus me quickly reviewing my calculations in a video like this. I know I did this really, really quickly, but if I wrote out the depth of shade and our stock solution concentration and had it over here, the hundreds cancel out, which is why I just sort of left that off, because I know that that would cancel out. And then the grams of dye cancels out, the grams of yarn cancels out, and since the units left is 1 over milliliters, then that gives us milliliters. So for units, people, if there's too much hand waving, that's how I sort of I abridged it for the back of the envelope calculation there.
I'm legitimately a little concerned that I went that too quickly, so I don't know if it made a lot of sense or made it any easier, but I encourage you to go play with the numbers and look back at this and see the relationship between each of these numbers. I'm sure I have 1 milliliter syringes somewhere, but I can't easily find it, so we'll just do a dilution for that small volume. My smallest syringe could technically do 0.3 milliliters, but it's worth just showing the dilution anyway, because it's not about the volume of liquid that we're going to be adding to each of the jars. What matters is the absolute amount of dye that we're adding. It doesn't matter that we're going to be dyeing these 20-gram minis inside little mason jars. We could be doing each of them inside a large pot with 8 cups of water and still get the same shade. The bigger difference is that with a smaller volume of water, you're probably going to get more tonal variation than you would if you're using a big pot. But in general, when doing measurements, it's best to use a graduated cylinder or a syringe that is as close to the volume you want as possible. For example, I'm not going to measure out 5 milliliters using a 30 ml syringe. I'm going to use the 5 milliliter syringe. one more note before we go dye the yarn. I mentioned that my stock solution is a little older, so maybe it's not going to be as accurate as a fresh stock. When you mix a stock fresh and you have everything in solution and it's maybe still a little warm, it's it's had time to shake, there hasn't necessarily been time for dye to crash back out of solution and settle, which sometimes does happen. And even with your best efforts as you're using the stock to shake it up as you go, I have found that in some colors, when you get to the very end, it might be a little bit more concentrated than you thought. Now, overall, it's probably still really, really close, but the best way to have the most accurate results is to measure out the dye, mix it fresh, and use it that day. So that's why when I'm doing, say, a triangle color mixing exercise, I always will mix up the stocks fresh, and you can still, as I use them days and days later with various other mixing videos, there is consistency. So you can have consistency, but I always in my mind, if I'm using an older stock, have a little asterisk in there just because there's a chance that if it wasn't as well mixed as I thought, that maybe it's not as consistent. But in theory, if you're shaking it really well before using it, even if something is sort of suspended in there, you should still be able to maintain consistency. But I wanted to point this out. Yeah, let's go dye the yarn now. Here I have 5 little mason jars that each have half a cup of water in them for our project. Now, we're going to be adding vastly different volumes of liquid to each of them for our dyes. If I were doing a project where the concentration of dye, not the absolute amount of dye, mattered more, then I would say to the second one, add 60 milliliters of water and add water to compensate for each of them. I'm not going to be doing that today. I believe I did this in one video just for fun, but I'm not doing this today because, as I mentioned, it is the absolute amount of dye, the grams of dye, that are important here. The volume isn't critical for the differences that we are going to see here. So I just wanted to make that clear, I suppose. To get started, I am going to shake our dye stock really, really well, and then pour some out, or most of it out, into a container. Now, I did forget that I will need to use 80 milliliters for our most saturated color. So in addition to the syringes, I will be using a graduated cylinder to measure out the 80 milliliters. I do miss having graduated pipettes, I'll tell you. And now, so that was 80. Now we're gonna do 20. We're gonna do 5. And then I think for the final 2, I'm gonna go ahead and make a dilution. So now I'm gonna make my dilution, and I'm gonna add 20 milliliters of water to this teeny little cup that I barely ever get the chance to use. And to that, I'm gonna add 5 milliliters of our dye stock, and then stir it up. Because our new diluted stock is 5 times less concentrated than the original, we're gonna need 5 times the volume to add. And so I can use these numbers right here. So this 1.5 is just 5 times the 0.31, and 6.25 is 5 times the 1.25. And so doing this dilution is allowing us to measure a bigger volume of dye, which is easier to measure with better accuracy. That is the plan, and now I'm going to go make the dilution. Okay. And now I can add a little over 1.5 milliliters of our dilution to our smallest one. And now I'm going to use my 10 milliliter syringe to measure out about
6.25 milliliters of our more dilute stock, and there we go. And actually, you can see on here that we do have a yellow gradient. You can visually see the difference in the concentration of the dyes. This one does look more golden yellow, and this one does look brighter. And so they will probably look different as we add the yarn, or they might look more similar, but that's what we're ready to do now. I want to increase the volume of liquid in these jars. So I'm now going to add another 1/2 cup of water to each of them. There is still no acid in here. Now let's add these 20-gram mini skeins to the jars. And it looks like our palest one is very much a buttery yellow. And we are going through. Now I think that yellow is, again, a color where doing more careful calculations may be important, because I think that it's possible that when we look at these, a lot of the colors are going to feel really similar. Now this one is very pastel, and same with this one right here, so that is good. Now this is the third one is our 1/4%, and then here is our 1%, and then finally our 4%. So I could see right now, looking at this, how someone could feel that if we only stayed within this range, which is the range that I often use, it might be extremely subtle. The only reason why it's not extremely subtle right now is because each one is a 1/4 of the amount of dye as the previous one. And I'd say even so, these two look fairly similar to me right now. I am going to non-specifically just increase the volume of water a bit to make it a little more consistent. And so just remember what I said before, that it's not the actual volume of water in here that is important, it's the total amount of dye. This one is real pastel, wow. So it just also shows you how little dye you need if you want to get something that is very pastel versus how much you need if you want something that is more golden. And we got something with this 4% that does feel very, very golden. So now we need to add some acid. And I am gonna add just 5 milliliters, 1 teaspoon of white vinegar to each of these jars. We may end up needing to add more, especially with that deepest color, but we'll go ahead and wait and do that later on. Each time I'm bringing my spoon over to stir or move things around, I am rinsing it or wiping it before doing this, and I'm going from the least concentrated container to the most. Without wiping in between. But I wouldn't go the other way around, because I think that if I were to dip this spoon into, say, the darkest and go into the lightest, that would affect the color that we have there. All right, we are stirred up. When I have a lot of samples, I like to do a cool vat approach, where I would then let the yarn and the dye sit for 24 hours or longer before heat setting it. But since there's only 5, I am putting them inside a steamer basket inside my dedicated dye pot. And I'm gonna fill up water, so that way the water that I add in the bath is just below the water level of these jars, and we'll go to the stove to heat set it. Now I'm going to heat this up, and I'm going to heat it for at least 30 minutes before we evaluate and see whether we might need to add more acid, especially in our most concentrated yellow. This technique is really, really useful, both to create a fun fade set, but also to look at a particular color, get an understanding for the depth of shade, and learning, therefore, how much dye you might want to get that color you want.
So this is something I extremely recommend doing before, say, dyeing a sweater's quantity of a semi-solid or of a tonal, so that way you get the actual color that you want. Whether you do something like this with mixing different colors, or if you're just looking at the depths, various depths of shade of one color or of a mixture you already know has the hue that you want. So it's absolutely a learning process. The main things are that we are using a logarithmic scale when we're doing our dilutions here. So each time we go to a more intense color, we're using 4 times the amount of dye, which means that the difference between two of the others is even bigger than that. I think that you would find that if you were going to do, say, 0.2, 0.4, 0.6, 0.8, and then 1% depth of shade, you probably will not see a lot of difference in those colors. You need there to be larger steps in the change of the amount of dye you're adding to have a bigger visual difference. Dyeing yarn doesn't have to be math heavy. It can be if you want, and if you want something that is reproducible and to make recipes for colors that you can draw back from, these things can be really, really helpful. And also, I find them fun. And it's also worth talking about, again, I talk about this all the time, but a depth of shade is talking about one color relative to itself. It's not talking about one color relative to no color at all, and it can vary. So for a dye like a yellow, a 4% depth of shade might give this really golden yellow, but that might be less intense, less pigmented overall than a 0.5% of a black. And so this is something to keep in mind as you're planning. And so this exercise might be worth doing for various colors. You can't necessarily extrapolate the results from one onto another color or another brand because the intensity does vary a bit, which isn't to say that you can't approximate. For example, in the other videos that I've done this, I tend to do a range between starting at a 1 or 2% depth of shade going down to either a 0.125 or a 0.0625%. So that's a range that is one where I typically start. But for yellow, I knew I wanted to go a little broader to try to really intensify that range. So that way it can be visually intense. Okay, it has been 30 minutes. I'm imagining that the most pastel is probably clear. So let's look at our most concentrated yellow. And I'm gonna need to bring my tongs over to help. That is mostly cleared. Oh, you guys can't see it all. There's a little bit of yellow left in there. Most of it is in, I'm gonna rinse these off. Most of it is in the yarn. I'd say same here. There's just a hint left. Okay, and that one is looking really, really clear. Okay, so this is what we're gonna do. I'm gonna go ahead and add 2 teaspoons of vinegar to, might as well just add 1 more to our palest yarn. Then give it a quick little stir. Okay. Sometimes you might need a little more acid, sometimes you might just need a little more time. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna let this heat for 15 more minutes, and then I'm gonna turn off the heat and let things cool off slowly. At some point I might remove these jars from the dye bath so it cools off a little faster, but I will be leaving the heat on for at least 15 more minutes. And I guess if you wanted to keep things warmer, I could put a lid on here and that would help trap the steam and more heat as well. So I'm just choosing not to do that today. Now it is time to leave no dye behind. This is actually that rinse bath, the water bath that I used for dyeing the yellow minis.
And I'm taking a skein of dry Stroll fingering weight yarn, which is pretty much the same as the titanium, but as it's also 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon, the main difference is that it's 4-ply and a different brand. So there is that. The water here is still warm. It is still warm, but I have not yet added any acid to it. So I'm going to lift up the yarn, add my leftovers, which do include the rest of that new stock that I made, plus I guess cleaning out the syringes and graduated cylinders. So I'm expecting that we'll get a pretty pale yellow from this. And so I'm now coming back in and I'm moving the yarn around to give us some evenness in the color that we are getting. We'll probably still have a tonal, but if I had just put the yarn in and didn't move it around, then we probably would have had something a bit more concentrated. Now let's add some vinegar, and that's not even a whole tablespoon. Oops. If you ever wonder why I pour the vinegar into a cup instead of just pouring from the jug, it's because the jugs are heavy and it's easier to measure. Not that measuring is that important right now, but I can already see some tonal nature for this beautiful pastel butter yellow. And I'm going to turn on the heat and heat it probably for about 15 minutes. Then I will let it cool off in the dye bath so it can cool completely. And water's a little warm, but that lasts a little bit of dye. So yeah, when this is cool and when our other yarn is cool, then we will get ready to go wash it. Here is our lovely gradient. As we get ready to wash the yarn, I want to point out that this basin looks like it's a little bit yellow, but that's some of the light of these minis reflecting on it. And I do want to show that the water from our deepest yellow has cleared completely. But now I'm going to remove all of these minis and being very, very careful as I open them to not tangle them. When I lift the mini out, before trying to open it, I squeeze out the liquid. And then as I pick it up delicately and watch for where it separates, and then pay attention to the direction the strands go. With these kinds of mini skeins, it is really, really easy to pull the yarn through the ties and end up tangling something. So that's why I try to do it very carefully. And I'm laying it like this so that way I can add a zip tie on. Ooh, this yellow. I would say this yellow right here, I guess number 4, is the closest to our Leave No Dye Behind. And I am going to be really, really curious to compare this palest yellow because right now, next to all these other yellows, this looks like there's no color at all. But I will try to remember to compare it to a bare skein to see how much more pigment there is than no pigment at all. And when it comes to washing, I'm not seeing any color come out, but let's add some dish soap in here. I don't think yellow acid dyes are ones that ever give me much of an issue. If I see bleeding, it's usually like a blue or a pink. But there's no bleeding here, so I am going to go ahead and rinse out all the soap, put the yarn through my spin dryer, and hang it up to dry. Let's take a closer look at our finished yellow yarn. Here is the finished yellow gradient. We looked at 5 different depths of shade, starting at a 4% DOS, 1%, and all the way to 0.015%. Each of the minis is 4 times as concentrated as the one to its right. And as you can see, we have a really beautiful spread range of yellow, from a golden more mustardy hue, all the way to, I guess, a butter yellow that almost feels cream. And just to quickly compare that palest shade to an undyed skein. It's pale, but there's definitely absolutely color in there. I think that this range does really help with what I was saying all along, in that yellow, even at a really concentrated high depth of shade, equivalent of 4 grams of dye to 100 grams of yarn, the tone is still overall medium toned. And so if this was a 4% depth of shade of almost any other color, it would be way more pigmented. But you can also see, even though this is all yellow, this is a primary color, the more dye we add here, we're starting to get almost into a yellow kind of category. So if we were to pump this more and more, we would start to see orange. And so I think that in terms of dye, that's just something to keep in mind. If you really want a gradient of yellows, to have there be an extreme shift in colors, you really need to use a wide range of depths of shade. Now, often I think that this is the more of the region where I might do one of these depths of shades. I mean, maybe I would go up to 2, but like a 1%, this is a 1/4%, and then I think 0.06 to 5% depth of shade. And so within this range, it's still a very nice gradient, but these two feel a little close. And so if you were, say, going between a 1/4% and 1%, it might not feel like a lot of gradient. So it's important to consider the range of colors that you're doing, and doing this exercise on this greater range to really bring us to a pastel, to one of the most saturated ways that the color can be, is a good way to get a sense of, okay, the extremes are more than what I want. What range of color do I want? I brought in an undyed skein one last time just because I thought that it worked really well for this nice gradient. But I mean, clearly we did again add color, even though this one does look almost bare. Now, I don't have plans to do this with all of the colors that I have in my collection, but if achieving reproducible colors or getting an understanding of your different colors to then have a feeling of how you might want to mix them to get all the colors of a rainbow or to get the colors you want, just like the triangle color mixing exercises are a really useful tool to understanding the relative potency of colors to one another, looking at different depths of shade like this is a really great way to understand the potency of one color relative to itself. And so therefore, if you want a really bright yellow, maybe you would go for the 1% depth of shade. But if you want it to be more golden, then you would pump up the volume of dye, or I guess the weight of dye, to have a higher ratio, say of 4 grams of dye per 100 grams of yarn. So these are all things that are worth considering when you're doing your dyeing process. And if you're someone who wants or who's interested in making a swatch book, these are things that are very interesting swatches to have and to keep for your reference, because it can help you plan recipes moving forward. And likely from brand to brand, there's probably some amount of similarity, but especially on the low end, it's possible that between, say, even Dharma and Jacquard, or bringing other brands into consideration as well, there might be some differences at the low end of the scale and the high end of the scale. But probably around like 1% might be fairly similar for some of the primaries. But again, I haven't tested this. This is just a hypothesis. We did have some leftover dye, although it wasn't quite as much as I thought. In the containers, it looked like there was probably a fair amount, but I would say that we are between a 1/4% and a 0.625% depth of shade, being closer to this skein right here. Although there are some areas that are a little bit deeper. So not a lot of dye. Probably would have been more pigmented on a 20-gram mini, but since we did 100 grams here, yeah, we can approximate the depth of our color here. And so this is another reason why potentially I haven't started planning to have a swatch book myself, but having a swatch book can be handy, because if you dye something with leftover dyes and love that hue and want to try to replicate it, having something like this can help you sort of figure out about how much dye you had, so then maybe you can recreate it. So it's just another use. I think one big reason why dye manufacturers do, like Dharma does a lot of pastels, is that the hue, when you get down to a low depth of shade, some of those small tweaks can be really hard to mix, because it's really, really hard to measure out, what, 0.015 grams of dye. To get a quantity this low of this color, you would make a dye stock and then measure out the liquid. That's the easiest way to consistently get that small amount of dye, because you'd introduce a lot of error, unless you have a really, really precise scale. You'd introduce some error otherwise with your measurements. So a benefit of pre-mixing, say, maybe a duckling yellow, which has other pigments in it probably, I don't think it's a primary, but having something that is a pastel color like that is handy, because you can then, when you weigh out the 1 gram, you'll get something that is paler already, and so it's easier to weigh the amount of color. So for cost effectiveness, it makes more sense to purchase primary colors or more pigmented colors. A lot of times they might be a little more expensive to correspond to this fact, but if you're buying pre-mixed pastel colors, you're paying for a lot of filler. So I don't know. It's just worth thinking about. I love pre-mixed colors, so I will continue to buy and use them. But as I'm headed on more of a color mixing, color planning journey that I seem to be on, it's worth keeping this in mind. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching.